All right, this is going to be a response to a series of thoughtful comments I received on my video, The Empirical Case for Gun Control. I kind of have a rule of thumb. If I find myself wanting to type a very long comment in reply to somebody, I consider the possibility that maybe I should just do a video about it. It's much easier to express. I can say a lot more. And then the dialogue, instead of just being between me and the one person and maybe whoever else happens to see the comments, which is usually not going to be many people, can share those thoughts with others. So I wanted to respond to this because this was one of these comments were definitely made in good faith. This person seems to be arguing from an intellectually honest position and from a much more reasonable position than most people in the gun control debate. Typically in the gun control debate, when you have people who are in favor of gun control, their rhetoric and their stance, if not explicitly, at least implicitly, is that all guns are bad, guns are just killing machines, guns have no value, and they should be basically eliminated, with a understanding that that is not possible or practical in the short run, but should be something that should be worked at incrementally. And most of the policies that they advocate would be unlikely to have any real effect on crime or total homicide deaths or suicides or anything like that, but would well, it depends on what we're talking about, but would be serve as a incrementalist approach to a general ban. They're not coming from the perspective of primarily attempting to address actual gun violence, but from the perspective of primarily attempting to restrict guns, which are two separate things. And one of the basic problems with the debate is that those two goals are linked as synonymous in the minds of gun controllers, when I think that, and what I'll go into here is that they're not. But anyway, so the commenter Andy left a very long comment, and then I replied, and he left a long message. And I'm going to try and copy and paste his comments, and I'll put them in the description of this video for anyone who would like to read them or to go back into the empirical case for gun control video to see those. But the gist of his comments were he's a gun owner, he doesn't want to ban all guns, he thinks guns are fun and that they have a place, but that there should be restrictions, right? And so instead of banning types, which he doesn't really talk about so much, he thinks that there should be licenses, there should be registration, and there should be like education. People should have to take classes. They should have to learn gun safety. And this is, in my opinion, a much more reasonable approach. These are actually measures that are more likely to prevent certain types of gun-related crimes. For instance, requiring people to get training does one thing for sure. It makes it more likely that people are going to have some basic understanding and that they are then going to be less likely to commit an accident where they hurt themselves or somebody else, probably themselves, but potentially somebody else. And also, if they were ever actually in need of using their weapon, if they had good enough training, and that's a big if, but if they had sufficiently good training, the odds that they would then use their weapons in a safe and effective manner are much higher. Guns are really amazing in the sense that you know you can pick one up for the first time and be lethal with them. However, in practice, in the spur of the moment, when you're actually, say, getting mugged or getting broken into, or your home is getting broken into, you're getting assaulted. If you've never practiced, if you've never done any kind of target shooting or draw shoot, or any kind of preparation, the odds that you're going to be able to effectively employ the implement, aren't that great. You could still do it, but you could make a mistake. You could shoot somebody else. So, somebody who has a lot of training is going to be more effective with the gun and also less likely to cause an accident. But there are reasons why I would oppose even these, and I want to go into them here because, I think that this how could people kind of assume how could you possibly be against this? So the first thing is that this is basically like laying a tax. You're putting a costly restriction on gun ownership, and it depends what the regulations are, what the license requires, right? So you could have a license that costs $1 a year, and you just apply to it. Yeah, that wouldn't be a very high barrier to entry, but then that wouldn't do very much in terms of stopping people or giving people training. So on the other hand, you could say, well, the license is $500 a year per gun per person, and that you need to have 50 hours of training and blah blah blah, and that would make it the people who would own the guns are then much more likely to have some training, some minimal amount of training anyway. And if, gun owners are widely they differ wildly in terms of how much they utilize their firearms. There's gun owners who own a lot of guns or own a few guns and never shoot them. Right? There's gun owners who own guns that they've never fired. I know people who own guns that they have never taken to a range and they've never shot. Versus people who shoot them periodically or seasonally, maybe hunters who, they take the shotgun out. A lot of hunters will go and they'll sight in the rifle once or a week before hunting season, and then they'll go out and they'll hunt with it, and then that's pretty much it they do year by year. And then you have other people who practice every week or even every day. So the proficiency level among gun owners varies tremendously. You have some who are basically elite level, that they would fare very well in the military or even the special forces or in competitive shooting. I mean, the best competitive shooters can shoot the crap out of your average military people or even excellent military people. Then you have people who, like I said, could barely, probably can't disassemble them, probably can barely load them, never fire them, don't have great aim. So, let's say you had enough training to certify that somebody, could do basic firearms safety and execution or use. You might be able to stop accidents, but what you would be then doing is imposing this cost on everybody, and people on the margins would then not be able to afford them, right? So you have people who maybe they can afford to buy a cheap handgun or a used handgun, or to inherit one from a relative. Right? These people can get guns for free from an aunt, an uncle, a father, a grandfather, from an inheritance, and yet they might not be able to afford the license. And how expensive is the license? So we already know there's the danger here of licenses being just used as an excuse to prevent people from owning. And this is hardly some hypothetical fear. He mentioned in the comment, it's nice to have an ideology and a ideal, but what about in the real world? Well, in the real world, in the actual United States, there are plenty of cities and states that use the license as a way to just prevent people from either, and we have licensure for just being a gun owner, for owning a gun, for carrying a gun, depending on the state and the city. And we have places like New York City or Los Angeles, Cook County, where maybe technically the right exists, and technically you can get a permit or to either own or carry a handgun or a regular gun or whatever else. But then the license requirements are prohibitively difficult, to the point that it's just a facade. Or even if it's not a facade, that it's very difficult. So Massachusetts is not a facade. You can get a concealed carry permit in Massachusetts. I know people who have them, but they're difficult to get, especially if you live in a place like Boston. So it's not like this is some just a hypothetical fear on my behalf. Once you have the system of licensure, then you have the ability to basically prohibit people from joining to one degree or another. You will shrink the base of gun owners by some degree, and then you also have a legal mechanism by which you can ensnare gun owners. You can say, it's now a crime, right? You've committed a crime because you don't have a license, right? You haven't necessarily hurt anyone, you haven't robbed a person, killed a person, assaulted a person, but you haven't gotten the license. Now we can come take you in. And this is not a small deal. We have millions of people who are like incidental gun owners. They may not even realize they have one. Again, very common for widows to inherit weapons from their husbands, and they may be sitting in their basement and have no idea what's going on. That there even is a requirement for licensure, and let's say the fire department shows up because there's a fire, and they see the guns, and next thing you know, the widow's in prison or in jail. She's violated this law. The penalty would have to be fairly high to make people comply. And you've got this situation where an old lady who has done nothing really wrong is suddenly a criminal, a felon, potentially. So it's really not an illusory fear to think that this could be used as a way to just restrict gun ownership, so-called backdoor gun control. The other thing, like I mentioned, is even if it wasn't used that way for the licenses to have kind of the effect that you're going for, of actually reducing the number of guns in society, it's going to reduce those guns from the people who are the poorest. This is, I think, probably the main problem with this. If somebody's middle class or wealthy and they really care about guns, then they're probably going to be able to afford the license if you're not trying to make it prohibitive. But if somebody's poor, that's less likely to be the case. And same thing with like safes. I think requiring owning safes makes a lot of sense. It makes it more difficult not to commit crimes with your guns, but to have the guns stolen from you. And I think owning safes is a responsible thing. I own a safe. As you can see, I'm a big believer in that, but I got to tell you that safe cost me $1,300 and I cannot move it on my own. That's the whole point of having a safe that's that heavy. Someone can't just come and take it. And so not only did I have to pay that large amount of money, that's as much as I paid for my most expensive firearms. Um, and for me to move it, I can't do it on my own. I had to hire somebody to bring it to my place. I'm going to have to pay someone if and when I ever move, and it's going to cost me $200 or $300. Well, I can afford that. That's not a huge deal, and there's plenty of other gun owners who could, but there's lots of gun owners who can't. And imposing this on them is imposing a cost that will just make them not be able to be legal gun owners. They'll have to be, and this is the same with people like you have in like Australia or the UK, where like, yeah, sure, you can own a gun, but you have to keep it at a gun club. Well, then to keep it at a gun club, you have to become a member of a gun club. So you're not just saying, well, you need the money to buy the ammo and the cleaning stuff and the actual firearm and the license. You also now need to pay for the membership in the club and the probably separate storage fees, right? So this is just a way to pile on costs, and the end of the day, that's going to reduce the total number, and that's going to reduce the number of poor people who have them. Now, in his hearing me say that, it's going to make a lot of people think, well, good, that's the whole point. If we can reduce the number of guns, then that is what we want to do. And I'm going to quote here real quickly. Sorry, I should have had this dialed up. Sorry. Well, okay, yeah. We have this huge problem in our country stemming from the overabundance of this weapon designed for the express purpose of killing others. So this is the implicit logic kind of behind all gun control, right? That the reason that there is a gun problem or gun violence problem, however you want to term it in the United States, is because there is a so-called overabundance of firearms. And then he goes into that they're killing machines and whatnot. I would challenge this premise. Okay, first of all, what if he thinks there's an overabundance and they're just killing machines? Then what's the appropriate amount? That logic doesn't lend itself to the idea that, well, we should reduce the number of guns a little bit. That logic would imply that we should just eliminate guns altogether, right? Because none of these policies that you're talking about are going to end all gun violence, broadly defined. They're certainly not going to do anything about. They're not going to do much about gun suicide. It's granted if you lower the total number of guns in society and fewer people own them, then fewer people will commit suicide with them. But somebody who has a license, who's taken a safety class, who pays for a safe or whatever, can still kill himself with their gun. There's no way to stop that. And so you're still going to have probably a substantial number of gun suicides. I don't know if this person is someone who will lump gun suicides in with gun homicides, which is a conflation that I think is a mistake that shouldn't be done, because those are just different phenomenon, both morally, ethically, and in terms of how we approach dealing with them. And it's often lost in this debate when people talk about gun violence or gun statistics. They lump in gun suicides with homicides, despite the fact that they're so different in many ways, just because it will pump up the number. But even if we ignore suicides, these policies would not stop gun homicides. It's still possible to steal guns. It's still possible to obtain guns illegally. There's a huge stock of weapons that even if we had licensure tomorrow and full registration tomorrow, which the two are not necessarily the same thing, but even if you have them both, that would not mean that all guns would be accounted for. Guns can be created, they can be imported. There's too many out there already for there to suddenly not be any gun deaths. And then we're left in this logic of, okay, so let's say the number of gun homicides right now stands at around 10, 11,000. Let's say we implement these policies, and let's say they go down to 8,000, 6, 7, 8,000. Okay, that was maybe a good improvement, but that isn't still zero. We still have thousands of people every year being killed in gun homicides. So what would be, with the logic then of your thinking here would be, oh, there's still an overabundance of guns. We should restrict it even more. Maybe the license, instead of being $100 a year, should be $500 a year. Maybe the safe should be required to be so large, or maybe it has to be stored at a police station or whatever, and you have to obviously pay the fee for doing that. So there's that. But then the other problem here is that it's assuming that gun availability is what causes this. And actually, the empirical evidence is that that's probably not the case. It's much too complicated for that. And the easiest way for me to say this is to say, if you look at the United States, the number of guns in private hands, the total number of privately held firearms is increasing every year by several million weapons. Something like 3 to 5 million firearms are sold to the public every year in the United States. Some are destroyed or lost or deteriorate. Absolutely, in practice, probably hundreds of thousands, but you're still adding a net several million per year to the stock. And if we look, we don't have exact numbers, but it's a safe bet that from 1990 until now, something around 100 million guns have entered the private market. And yet homicide, suicide, all of these metrics of gun violence have decreased by about 40 to 50% in that same time period. So if the logic of having more guns equals more crime was true, then that should not happen. And it's hardly just that. We can point to many, many other examples. The United States has the highest per capita gun ownership rate in the world by a considerable margin. For this statement to make sense, to be logically true, to be an empirical fact, not just a theory, which is what it is, then the United States should basically have the highest homicide rate in the world, or near the highest homicide rate in the world. And this is not true. It's not even close. It's, I think, 76, 70, 70, 80, something like that. Then people like to cherry pick that data and say, well, we can't really compare the rest of the world. We can only compare the United States to these other countries, these other Western European countries. And that begs the question why that is. It seems like it's a little bit of special pleading. How come we can compare the United States with Luxembourg or the Netherlands or Sweden, but not Mexico or Brazil, two countries that we share in many important criminological senses much more in common than we do with these smaller, homogeneous, relatively wealthy, non-drug war countries. But even then, you don't see the relationship, right? So gun ownership rates, it's not like everybody else has none and the United States has a ton. Switzerland has high gun ownership rates. Sweden does. Norway does. Germany does. France does. Pretty much the only country in Western Europe that has dramatically low gun ownership rates would be like the UK. Iceland has very high gun ownership rates, and it has the lowest, like essentially the lowest homicide in the world. It's less than, how normally homicides are measured per 100,000. In Iceland, it's less than 1 per 100,000. Okay, so if you look at the full data, even if you look at like just the Western countries, it's still not clear that there's even a correlation, let alone causation. Again, we can never make that. It's such a basic logical error to say correlation equals causation, and yet there isn't a single argument for gun control that isn't kind of predicated on assuming that there is causation. And not only that, the correlation is not actually there. Like it's not you can't just say correlation because you compared one or two countries and say, hey, look at these two countries. One has guns, one doesn't have as many, one has higher crime. It doesn't really work. So if you look at Western countries, there isn't a correlation. The Western countries with the highest homicide isn't the United States, it's South Africa, and South Africa has restrictive gun laws. And so people will throw that out. One researcher, I said, well, South Africa shouldn't count because it has a history of racism and apartheid, and there's a lot of crime associated with that history, and so it shouldn't count. Well, that is also true. The United States doesn't have apartheid, but we have a history of racism and slavery and Jim Crow, and that is probably like based on the ethnic data of who's committing crimes to whom. That seems like very plausibly could be the case in the United States as well. Similar researchers will throw out Mexico. Oh, Mexico shouldn't count because they have a very violent drug war going on, and so that's pumping up their homicide rate. Yes, because there's not a drug war going on in the United States. It's special pleading all day long, every day. So there isn't really even correlation. And to the point of, well, maybe licensure will reduce crime. Well, we have states in the United States that do have licensure, right? Not every state does, but states like California does, Massachusetts does, New York, New Jersey, Hawaii, Connecticut, and these states don't have lower homicide rates on average, statistically correlatively. So I live in New Hampshire. New Hampshire has no licensure, no registration. You can carry concealed or open. You don't need anything, no permit, nothing, and it has the lowest homicide rate in the country, despite the fact that we have a really horrible heroin epidemic. Actually, there's a really bad heroin epidemic in New Hampshire. And if you go south of the border into Massachusetts, they do have registration and they do have licensure. You need to get a license to buy a gun in Massachusetts, and you need to register each and every gun. Certain types are prohibited, and concealed and open carry is technically legal, but restricted, and in some places restricted quite heavily, at least de facto, if not de jure. And yeah, the homicide rate in Massachusetts, it's comparable, but it's higher than it is in New Hampshire. Now, yes, are there other factors? Of course, absolutely. I'm not saying that the reason New Hampshire has low homicide is because of its lax gun laws. I'm just saying that evidently those lax gun laws are not making things worse because it's as good as it can be. And the similar could be said for Vermont, and similar could be said for Maine. Vermont literally has no state gun laws, or nearly no state gun laws, and historically has always been that way, and yet it has among in the top 2 or 3 lowest homicide rates. Maine, same thing, and those are not the only examples. You could throw out many more. So there isn't even, I mean, people have tried to study this. People have tried to look at the data and said, well, what about states that have this and states that don't? Does it actually causally lower crime or lower homicide? And the answer appears to be no, that there's no evidence of this. So you can have a principle in your comment, you kind of, and I'm saying you because it's nominally addressed to this commenter, Andy. He kind of criticized, oh, you can have a theory and an ideology, but I'm talking about pragmatism, and I want to know what really works. Well, this has been studied to death. All right, people like to throw out this canard that studying gun violence is illegal. I had a guy on Grindr the other day said, "Fun fact." I sent him a picture of me holding a gun, and he said, "Fun fact, it's illegal to study gun violence because of the NRA," which is totally wrong. There's a law that it was basically the CDC can't study gun violence, but anyone else can. Harvard can do it. The New England Journal of Medicine can do it. Any private organization, any university can do it. The only institution that can't is the CDC, and there were reasons for that. Was that they were obviously biased and they had an agenda, and it's not a disease, so it's not something that they should really be involved with. But there's this pernicious belief that it never gets studied. It has been studied. You can look at studies about whether or not licensure reduced, and not just in the United States, in other countries. And the correlation, there's not even a correlation there. And even if there was, that would beg the whole question of causation or correlation. So, yeah, there's no real evidence. And kind of explaining why, there's another problem. You can't just call what you consider common sense pragmatism. Pragmatism is what's the best theory, what's the empirically most justified, but also a realization that you're not perfect, that you are potentially that you're fallible, and you have to understand that there's a chance that you're wrong, and which is something that true ideologues don't have, right? A true ideologue is not pragmatic. Somebody who believes that they have the universal system that's preferable to every other system is not a pragmatist. There's somebody who thinks they know everything. They have the answer to everything and they know everything. That's not pragmatism. That's just runaway ideology. But the type of pragmatism that you're talking about, Andy, here, it's not pragmatism. It's you're just simplifying things. Okay, so we could look at, you're reducing it to how many people are being killed. You didn't go into the details between accidents, suicides, and homicides, which I think all three are different, and all three need to be addressed differently because they entail different things. And anything that reduces that number is good, and anything that doesn't do that is worthless. And I think that that's wrong. And here's why. We could do the same, and the comparisons to, say, automotive accidents or flying are often made. We could look at it and say anything that reduces car accidents is justified. Anything that we have 30,000 highway deaths, road deaths, traffic accidents deaths every year. Anything that we do that reduces that is good. Well, that would imply all sorts of things. That doesn't just imply drunk driving laws and seatbelt laws and having driver's license. That implies banning not only anyone who has a high risk of being in an accident, which would be young people, that would be old people, that would be people with any kind of record at all, any kind of, maybe not a great vision test, not, but not just those people. It would imply any people who have any risk, right? Even if you're very low risk, you get one fender bender every 20 years, there's a risk that you could still be in a fatal car accident, either for yourself or somebody else. And so as long as you're allowed to drive, then that's a risk. And the number of traffic deaths is not going to be zero. There's other things you could do. Vehicles are not perfectly safe. Right now, oh, you can have a seatbelt and you can have a shatterproof glass and you can maybe have airbags, but do you have ejection seats? Are the cars made so strong and so rigid that on impact you're like in a roll cage and there's no way that you're going to die? And maybe there's float implements so that if you go into off-road into a lake or off a bridge that you won't drown, or there's an ejection seat in case there's a fire, or there's fire suppression systems. We could do all that. We could build cars. There's a great clip of the 70s of Milton Friedman talking about this and said we could spend $10 million on every car to make it as safe as possible. And even that would not be perfectly safe. But then you have a car that costs $10 million and nobody can drive. And yet if you just reduce the only thing you consider, the number of people who die, and not the utility of the cars, the fact that people use them for other things, and that there's enough value to those other uses that you have to bear that into mind, right? You can't just look at the scale and say, I'm only weighing on one side. The only thing that matters to me are the downsides to gun ownership. That's the only consideration I have. Well, if that's the only consideration you have, first of all, you're not being pragmatic. You're being an ideologue, right? You're just saying this is literally the only thing that matters, and all the benefits of gun ownership are irrelevant to the point that I don't count them. Similar to saying all the benefits we have from owning cars and having car availability and having the autonomy to travel, you're saying I don't care about that. The only thing I care about is reducing homicide, the number of people who die on the roads, which, by the way, is more than the people who die from guns by a considerable margin, especially if we're talking gun homicides. So it's just not that simple, right? We could get to the point where if we're trying to reduce accidental deaths, we could just ban everything. We could ban using boats, we could ban pools, we could ban, because there are people who die in all of these things. And so if you reduce the dimension of the axis of consideration reducing death, then everything should be banned and everybody should be basically thrown into some kind of cushiony prison ward where they can't hurt themselves or anyone else. And yet that's absurd because it's ignoring everything for one. So guns have uses, guns have value, right? There's obviously recreational uses, there's hunting uses, there's self-defense uses, there's aesthetic uses, there's the defense against tyranny uses, which people are quite charged about, but I do think that although they're quite difficult to quantify, or those, that they are actually quite important. And rather than go into all of them, which would make this video way too long, I just want to talk about the self-defense ones, and then go back to the people who are going to be most harmed by the policies, the pragmatic so-called policies that you're advocating here, the poor. Okay, so poor people probably, in most cases, are the ones most likely to actually need a gun in self-defense. All right, if you live out in the suburbs and you're a wealthy middle-class NRA member who's got a house and a driveway, and you've got a gun safe and you can afford the license and all that, the chances that you're going to need a gun in self-defense are quite low. They're not zero, but they're quite low. And if you decide that you can't afford the licenses or the safe or the training classes or whatever it is, and you're a law-abiding citizen, so you give up your guns, the chances that you're going to get killed during a break-in or during a rape, if you're a woman, are not very high. Still could happen, but not very high. But if you are poor, if you live in a bad neighborhood, if you live in a bad part of town, if you live in a place where there's a lot of crime, and we do know that there's just certain sections of the United States where the crime is vastly more than other sections, if you live in those areas and you can't escape, taking that option away from you is not good. Okay, you are not safer now because you don't have a gun. I mean, people oftentimes are motivated because there's a rational fear that they might need one. And for this, I would recommend this book, Armed, Gary Kleck and Don Cates. And this is just about surveys, of which there's now many, of the number of defensive gun uses that happen in the United States. So this is again one of those aspects of the debate that is basically ignored by the gun control advocates. They basically assume that this either never happens, or if it does happen, it's so trivially inconsequential that it should be ignored. And that is just anti-scientific at this point. There's been considerable research into this. Lots of surveys, scientific, these are not just phone surveys or scientific studies, including done, I'll have to check, I'll try and find the link. Reason did a write-up about it. Apparently this, after Kleck's initial research came out, I think in 94 or 95, there was a lot of skepticism. A lot of people did follow-up studies and basically came up with similar results, some higher, some lower. Apparently the CDC did its own survey, and they actually came up with a slightly higher rate, and then they buried the data. They didn't report it. They covered it up, and it just came out like 2 years ago, I think. I'll try and find a link and put it in the description. Brian Doherty at Reason did a great write-up about it. So I'll try and find that and put it in there. But basically, the surveys that we have indicate that defensive gun uses should be numbered in the million, 2 million, 1 to 2 million. It's probably less now because crime is down, so it's likely it's proportionally fewer, but that's not insignificant. And most defensive gun uses just involve brandishing. They involve waving the gun, maybe firing a warning shot, even though that's itself fairly uncommon. And this, it's true that we don't know when people do that. We can't say for certain whether they would be murdered or not, right? If someone breaks into your house and you pull out a gun and they run away, it's not clear what was going to happen otherwise. Maybe you were just going to get robbed, maybe they're going to rape you, maybe not, maybe they're going to murder you. But given the relatively large number, the millions likely, 1 to 2, maybe even more million of individual defensive gun uses that happen per year, even a relatively small percentage of them resulting in the saved life or the prevention of an assault or a rape or a theft, those numbers are going to be, in all likelihood, very significant relative to the number of, say, gun homicides or even gun suicides. And the thing is, these defensive gun uses are not primarily going to be happening among the wealthy or the upper middle class suburbanite NRA members who can afford the licensures. They're going to be much more common among the rural poor, the urban poor, people who would not be able to afford a safe. If you live, I mean, when I had my safe moved here, they told me flat up, if I had lived on the second floor, I could not have had my safe. Right? If you live in New York City or Chicago and you live on the third floor of an apartment building, you can't have an effective safe, right? And so it's not just a cost, it's a prohibit. You just can't do it legally then, and then you're just automatically a felon if you try and have a weapon to defend yourself. And the logic here is that if we take the guns away, that there'll just be less death. It's not that simple, right? Even though restricting guns and reducing the number of people who own them is going to have an effect on the number of criminals who have them indirectly, right? Criminals don't follow the law. If you pass this law that says there needs to be licensure, the people who commit most of the homicides are not going to follow that. But you are going to reduce the total number of guns, and so the number that can be stolen, the number that can be misplaced, the number that can end up on the black market, it will go down. So criminals might have reduced access to firearms. Sure, I admit that. But the availability of guns for the law-abiding populace will decrease not the same amount, but more, because their compliance with the law will be higher than criminals. Well, reducing the firepower of the law-abiding populace relative to the aggressive criminal class is not necessarily a good thing. Even if you reduce the total number of firearms among the criminal class, if you reduce the total number of firearms among the law-abiding class even more, there's now a disparity that is not necessarily good. In fact, it's almost certainly bad. And we see this very, very glaringly in countries, and basically the rest of Latin America, whether we're talking about Mexico or Brazil or the Caribbean, where legal gun access is quite restrictive, and yet criminals have enough of them to inflict homicide rates that completely dwarf that the United States has ever had, even if you go back to the worst periods. So, it's far from obvious that the hypothesis that more guns equal more crime is even true. There's basically no empirical evidence that the laws implementing this would actually have that effect, right? We do have states, we have countries that have done this, and they don't see any kind of causal relationship there. You would be, and you say, well, the only thing, if you say I don't care about ideology, well, there are ethical arguments here, right? What you are talking about making people who are nonviolent, who have done nothing wrong, and saying you are a criminal now because we have prohibited you owning this without you getting the license. You shouldn't forget about the idea of tyranny and all that. Those are very real things, especially it seems obvious now that that's at least a possibility, however unlikely it may be. Uh, but uh, it's it's not something you can take for granted that if you reduce the number, the crime's going to go down. It's just not, because it's gone up in other situations. Like in the UK, when they did their big gun confiscation and buybacks in 1998 or 97, the homicide rate actually rose. Now, it wasn't a very high level to begin with, and it didn't rise dramatically, but it rose for about 7 years, and then it started to trend back down. Australia, which is the case people really love, they did their gun, not a complete gun ban, but they outlawed many types, and they instituted very restrictive licensure. They confiscated hundreds of thousands, and it's true, the homicide rate dropped after that. Whoa, wow, proof, right? No, well, their homicide rate started dropping 10 years before that happened. Look at any homicide chart, and you can see homicide rate in Australia started to drop in 1988. And whenever I've gotten lots of debates with Australians, thanks to my network of gay friends. I have a lot of gay Australian friends who are to a man anti-gun rights. Right? They're much worse than the British friends I have, and I've even my left-wing British friends are gun-friendly compared to the Australians. I think it's become a point of civic pride in Australia that they're kind of indoctrinated to believe that this is an example. It's kind of, people in the UK are taught that the NHS is this great civic triumph that they should all be proud of. Australians are view kind of John Howard and his not complete ban but heavy restrictions of guns as some kind of civic triumph. But it's a triumph that triumphed 10 years before it was implemented, right? So the homicide rates started crashing 10 years before it was actually implemented, which is like essentially proof that something else was lowering homicide rates and that the bans were at the very least superfluous. Are they? And whenever I've asked gun any of these Australians, why did the rate start to drop 10 years before, they don't have an answer. I mean, it sounds ridiculous to assume that it's from the ban that happened, I mean, it's like the time travel ban, I guess. But so, the examples people love to use really just don't even work. So no, I don't think that taking poor people's options away is good. I don't think making guns the purview of the at least middle class or rich is a good idea. I don't think it actually is going to reduce homicide. Might have some effects on suicide, but again, restricting people's rights to stop a suicide, I think, is not necessarily a good thing, especially the types of suicide. Right? There's lots of people who attempt suicide, and it's something like 80% of them fail, and there's obviously many people who attempt to commit suicide in a way that is not serious. People do it for attention. People do it as to, there's lots of things people do. I had a coworker once who tried to commit suicide, and he was at work the next day. So it wasn't a serious attempt. And people who are serious, they blow their brains out. But if you ban guns, and if you are serious about committing suicide, you do not need a gun. It's just it's the easiest option, right? So there's kind of this belief that if we ban guns, that there'll be fewer successful suicide attempts. No, they'll just jump off a really high building or find some other really effective means of doing it. Another great one is to jump in front of a moving train. That's about the same as using a shotgun on your head. According to if you want some morbid reading, the LA County, Orange County has done statistics on survival rates of different suicide means, and shotgun to the head and jump in front of the train are about the same. And somebody who jumps in front of someone who's going to shoot themselves in the head with a shotgun is not like playing a game or looking for attention. They're trying to kill themselves. And if you had no shotgun because there was a licensure law and you couldn't get one, or you didn't want to go to the trouble of getting the license before blowing your brains out, you would still just jump in front of the train. And I don't see why imposing on the rights of everybody else just to have that shift from shotgun to train or leaping makes any sense. So no, you can't just simplistically reduce something to one variable and one consideration. You don't do that for anything else. Life is a trade-off between different values and different virtues and different costs and different benefits. And as soon as you start looking at just the one thing, if you start saying the number one thing is having the stock market go up, or the number one thing is having everyone have health care access, even if it's poor care, or the number one thing is that we produce a lot of steel. This is like communists when Mao was in China. Well, if we just increase our steel output, that makes us a great country, right? The greater our steel output. So everything else gets sacrificed for this one metric that quite, in the sincere thinking of somebody's mind is going to help everyone. Uh, I'm sure many Marxists sincerely believe that if a country increased its steel output, that would be beneficial in some obvious way, and yet that was a terrible calamity that contributed to the deaths of millions of people. Um, if you're only looking at gun deaths and you don't weigh the good that they do and the value that they have, again, they're recreational, they're hunting, their defense against tyranny, their aesthetic value, their value in the marketplace, but even more, probably the most important is their use in self-defense. And their use I mean, that's an interesting question. We can debate how frequently that is, but we do have a lot of empirical data. There have been a lot of studies. I would go to the plate with anybody on that it's significant enough that you can't just discount it and say who cares, it doesn't matter. Um, so uh, anyway, yeah, I definitely didn't want to put this all into a comment. Thank you very much, Andrew. Well, let me make sure I'm saying this right. Yes, Andy, it was a very thoughtful comment. That's why I'm giving it a video. I'll put a link so you'll see my response. And I appreciate that this isn't a let's ban all guns. Although I don't see implicitly in the logic here, I don't see why that wouldn't be your position, right? If gun availability is the cause of our problems, then why would you only want to reduce gun availability on the margins? You should want to reduce gun availability completely, right? Because there is the stuff you're talking about will not end like gun deaths. It won't end suicides. It won't end accidents, even if it reduces both of those. And I think it has the best chance of reducing those two categories. And it's certainly not going to end homicide, even if hypothetically it reduced it. I mean, we don't have evidence that it really would, but even if it did, we'd still be having thousands of gun deaths. And so, it's very similar to these, after these gun mass shootings, they'll implement policies that clearly will not stop mass shootings. And that's how it's a slippery slope. You can say, oh, you're just saying that. But uh, the next time more people die, it's not like the gun controllers are going to say, well, we already have registration of all guns, so we're satisfied. We're not going to change the law now. The only logical course for them to take based on their ideology, on their position, is to restrict guns even further, to the point of banning them completely. And there's plenty of, I think the only intellectually honest gun controllers are the people who say that. I don't know anyone on the gun control side who is willing to say they accept a certain number of gun-related deaths because guns have some value. That would be the most reasonable thing. So they might say, well, I equate that the total value of guns to society is worth 1,000 lives. And so if we got down to 1,000 lives, I would be happy with that. I've never, ever heard that said by anyone. And that sounds very callous, but that's the case. Now, the other thing, too, is that there might be measures we can take to reduce this number, and we can have our cake and eat it too. Like, a lot of these crimes are related to the drug war, so there's a lot that can be said about reducing the drug war. There's a lot that can be said about what's causing crime in these certain high crime areas, whether it be Chicago or East St. Louis or parts of New York or parts of LA. Um, you know, those areas, their high violence is certainly not a result of gun availability. These are places that already have the most restrictive gun control laws. If gun availability is what caused there to be high homicide, then you would expect, New Hampshire or Indiana or South Dakota to have the high, or Wyoming to have really high gun homicide problems, and they don't. So it's not as easy a solution, because what causes crime and how do you stop crime is much, much more complicated a question of what do you do about guns, because it seems so simple. Oh, we just ban them or register them or license them. That'll solve the problem. Empirically, that probably won't solve the problem, and it opens up the door for backdoor gun restrictions, backdoor gun confiscations. It reduces the number. It shrinks the gun culture, reducing the political power of the base of the gun rights movement, which currently is quite strong. Strong enough basically to stop what you're talking about from actually happening in most states and across the country, thankfully. And that's probably also the real reason behind it. The idea of, so if they can't take everything right away, they make it harder for people to join that movement, and then they can eat away at it. And some of them will admit that, but even the ones who don't, that's implicitly is the only thing that makes sense, the only position that makes sense. So anyway, I will talk to you all later. Have a good day. Bye.